Hello dear viewers, support me by subscribing to my channel and share my video if you like it, and also make sure you comment your thought. Now let's start the video. Bruvos 2090 AC. Sir Richard Lonmouth. While he was worried about the king and were for anything but what he came here for, he'd not have left. Richard knew how important this was to Jay. He also knew that despite him having very little actual power, the mere fact he lived and was free created potential problems for them. There was no telling what one man, especially if he was determined enough, could do. He was proof of that had been the spider, and he'd not allow Littlefinger to ever rise high enough so that he'd ever be in a position like that. Finding the man had been easy enough. Not only was Littlefinger a man who enjoyed his comforts and had the coin to provide for them, but like a moth to a flame, he too was attracted by something that he couldn't resist: power. So all Richard had needed to do was keep an eye on the Seal Lord's palace and an eye on the key holders of the Iron Bank, and it was with one of the latter that he found him, with Littlefinger looking almost ridiculously thin and small next to the large fat form of Basaro Rashani. Following the man back to his manse, which though large, wasn't as big as some of the others, Richard smiled when he saw the king's eagle nesting in a nearby tree, the large Westerosi bird standing out as most strange amongst the birds of Essos. Jade had told him that the eagle would lead him to Littlefinger, that he'd be waiting for him and would show him the way. But given what had happened to his king, it had not been so. Instead, it seemed the bird had just stayed close by and waited rather than seek him out. As he looked at it, he began to chuckle. Would he have found him through the bird had things been different? Would he have just sought the eagle out? Who could tell? As it was, he had no need to do so. He turned to Rylan and Dallor, the two bards both looking intently at the manse and the guards. "Well?" he asked. "A tough nut to crack, Richard," Dallor said. "Better to take him in the open," Rylan added. "We risk bringing the Bravosi down on us if we do that," Richard said to them. "Not if we do it right, the gate," Rylan said, and Richard looked at him, and then the manse. "What gate?" "The Mummers' Playhouse. It's owned by a man named Isambaro, the self-styled king of the Mummers. Every Bravosi with coin ends up at one of their plays, and on the night of a new one, those with the most coin always show up. The Sea Lord and the fat banker will no doubt attend, as I would expect, will our slittery friend," Rylan said, and Richard nodded. Leaving one of the other bards to keep an eye on the manse and to make sure the mockingbird didn't fly off somewhere else, Richard walked with Rylan and Dallor to the gate and began to make his plans. There seemed to be only one route to the gate itself, and after speaking with Rylan and Dallor, they agreed on the best place to set their men for the ambush, and now all he had to do was wait. Breaking his fast the next morning with Wyvern, he thought he'd found a potential flaw in his plans. The Lord of White Harbor telling him that the Blue Lantern and the Dome were the great and good of Bravos preferred to watch their plays. Rylan, though, seemed to know far more about current events in Bravos than the Large Lord did. That's true, but a year ago, someone tried to kill the Sea Lord as he sat in the Dome, and the Blue Lantern has fallen out of favor ever since their leading lady, Mummer, married a visiting magister from Lorre, Rylan said. "I knew there was a reason I kept you with me other than your skills with a blade," he said with a small laugh, as he patted Rylan on the back. "What can I say, Sir? I like mummers," Rylan said, as they walked to the small street they intended to use as their point of attack. When the day came, they were ready. Richard had set his men up at both ends of the street, the archers all bearing arrows that had been dipped in poison. It may not be needed, but he would take no chances that he'd lose the mockingbird again. He'd arranged it with both Wyman and Willis to be ready to leave that day. Nothing too hurried, as he didn't want to leave even the slightest suspicion that it was they who'd done this. But once they had him, there was no need to stay any longer than needed. It felt like an age until the sun began to go down and the day turned to night. Richard standing on the rooftop and looking down the street at his men and at the entrance to it. Just as keenly, Rylan had set the archers up, and Dallor would lead the men who'd handle anything on the ground. So there was no true need for him to be here, and yet he wished to see it through personally. He knew how much Jack would appreciate this, and how long he himself had been waiting to see the mockingbird pay. No, he had to be here. "Settery," Braden said, handing him the pouch and pointing to the end of the street. "And now it begins," Richard said, taking a swallow of the cooled wine and placing his hand on his sword just as if he was down there with them. For a man who had incurred the wrath of a king with dragons, Littlefinger seemed very assured of his safety. At his manse, he had perhaps 40 or 50 paid swords in his employ, but he walked into the street with less than 6. Richard looked down to Ryland and saw the man and the other bards stand with their arrows ready to fire, and then, when Littlefinger passed the point of no return, and when he was a little more than halfway down the street, the signal was given. Looking at the arrows fly through the night sky, Richard thanked the gods for a clear night with a full moon. It allowed him to see everything as clear as day, and he watched as the guards all began to fall. As quiet as it was, it also allowed him to hear the almost womanly sound that came from Littlefinger's lips, though he didn't hear the sound of the man's water as it dripped down his breeches and onto the street below. Richard only finding out the man had soiled himself when Dallar and his men grabbed him and put the gag and sack over his head, and they then moved him to the ship. He sent one of the men back to tell Wyman and Wellis that he'd meet them on the ship itself later that day, and the rest of them hurried through the city. The bright, clear sky was now a hindrance rather than a help. They passed by more than one guard patrol, though their presence wasn't detected, and finally they reached the docks and the ship. Richard not truly feeling comfortable until he had the man stripped and searched thoroughly, and then tied up in the room. "No one but one of our men, you understand," he said to Dallar as he organized the guards. "I understand, sir," Dallar said, and Richard nodded, knew the man would do as bid. Wyman and Willis arrived just after noon, and both men were just as eager to return to Westeros as he was. Wyman looking at him curiously as the ship ready to set off. "Did you catch your slippery bird, Richard?" Wyman asked as the ship finally left the dock and was setting out to sea. "Of course I did. I promised our king a present, and trust me, Wyman, this is one he very much desires," he said, before turning to go down and speak to the mockingbird, and see what secrets he could learn and what offers the man would make, should he release him. The first would be most welcome, the second ignored. The man had nothing he could offer him to stop what was to come. Soon enough, they'd be back in King's Landing, and the Mockingbird would face a judgment that was long overdue. Richard only hoped and prayed that his king had awakened by then to see it done personally. King's Landing, 2098 AC. Shira. She'd read as much as she could and had even done her very best to remember each and every moment she'd spent with Brendan. Shira quickly finding that some rocks were best left untouched and not looked under. Aemon had helped out where he could, both with the reading and with the doubts and concerns she raised about her own part in things. Not that anything he'd said had made her feel less responsible for Jade's condition than she did. It wasn't until news came of her nephew's recovery that she even began to move past blaming herself, and yet she knew that it would be a long time until some of the others did likewise. The Queen, for one, had blamed her, and rightfully so, Marjorie refusing to allow her anywhere near Jade's rooms, let alone her nephew himself. Others had soon come around to that way of thinking, and though none had spoken it aloud, they hadn't needed to. Shiara finding that unless she was on Rhaegar's back, she couldn't truly get away from the pointed looks and glares that people threw her way. To keep herself occupied when she couldn't get to fly on Rhaegar and was in no mood to be subjected to the scornful looks she received on her way to Aegamon's room. Shiara worked on enchanting more of the gems, finding one in particular which intrigued her and had taken most of her attention for the last few days. While not anywhere near as potent as her ruby, and certainly not Aegamon's, she'd found that the small ruby offered some possibilities, and so she'd taken some blood from herself and from Rhaegar, and had added it to it. It was finally ready to be used, and so removing her own ruby, she stood in front of the looking glass and placed this one around her neck. She watched as small things began to change. Her eye color, her hair, little things, and she knew then it would work for what she wished it for, and she hoped that Jax would allow her to gift it to the girl. It was as she was doing this that the knock came to the door. Shiro moving to find that it was one of the king's guard and not an ordinary guard or servant who'd come to speak to her. "His Grace wishes to speak to you," Ser Jorah said, and she nodded as she followed the man from the room. They walked through the corridors, and Shiera saw the looks directed at her once more, this time doing her utmost to ignore them. Soon enough they reached the king's chambers, and as she looked to Sir Richard and Sir Arthur, she was shown through to the room. Inside she found that Jaime, Tyrion, and Aemon awaited, and as they stood there, she could see they knew as little about this meeting as she. Though Aemon did hold the Dreamer's Journal in his hand, and so she imagined it was about that. After a few moments, Sara the Walder came out with Jay leaning against him, Morgari walking alongside the knight and glaring at her when she saw her. "You'll have to forgive the spectacle," Jay White said, as Sir Walder helped him to a seat, and Jay bid them all to take their own before sending the king's guard from the room. "You feel well, nephew?" she asked. receiving another glare from Marguerite and a smile from Jack. "I do want, Uncle, the book, if I may," Jane said, and Aemon handed it to him, Jacia closing his eyes before opening it, and then handing it to Marguerite, and then to Aemon, Tyrion, Dany, and finally her. Looking down at the page, she could see the writing that was now there, and she turned to see that each of the others were just as surprised as she was. "This was empty. I mean, other than that one page," Dany said as Shara flicked through to see that only that and this one had any writing on them. I know. That part you've just read. It's a song that Jamesy's told me to read while I was dreaming." Jamesy had holding up his hand to stop any questions. "The words themselves mean everything, but that's for another time. And you may need to read this." Jamesy had closing his eyes and opening the book once more. She read through it quickly before dropping it to the floor. The shocked gasp she made causing Marguerite to rise to her feet, only for Jay to grab her hand and bid her sit. "The book," Aunt Jack said, and she bent down to pick it up and handed it back to him, watching as he opened up the page and showed it to Marguerite before then handing it to the others to allow them to read it too. This makes no sense," Tyrion said, and she was glad he had because she'd not been able to speak since she'd read the words that showed that her actions, that all of it was or had been known. "How could she have known?" Marguerite asked. "Danak saw the future, Marge, as clearly as any ever had. Some of it, no doubt, confused her completely. Which is why the words don't fully fit, but you all read what it said." Jane said as Shara thought on the words themselves. "One eye of green and one of blue. Her aim may seem wrong, but is true. Though he thinks she does it for him, in truth, she does so for you. A prince must see what a raven cannot. Travel where he can't follow. Though he'll fall today, none should fret. For he'll rise stronger and wiser on the morrow." "Why, nephew? Why is this needed?" Aemon asked, and Shara looked as Jay closed his eyes and held the book before opening it once more. "Read it aloud, Uncle," Jay said, handing Aemon the book. She moved forward in her seat and noticed that both Dany and Tyrion did the same, while Jay took Marguerite's hand in his own and brought it to his lips before kissing it softly. "The prince that was promised will bring the dawn and sing the song of ice and fire. He'll wake dragons from stone, and what was lost shall return once more. The house of the dragon will rise and higher than it has ever done before, and the lands eternal shall be renewed and open once again. The dragon must have 3 heads, one who lives, one who died, and one who is reborn. Life, death, and rebirth, 3 heads, but just one prince to unite them all. He shall conquer life, death, and then he shall bring about the rebirth. The fight will come, but in the end, there can be only one." Aemon said, finishing reading the words. "There is much that we must do, but first things first. It's time I paid a visit to a man with 1,000 eyes and one," Jack said, looking at each of them. King's Landing, 2998 AC. Benjen, seeing his brother and a man who he later found out to be Prince Oberyn waiting for him on the docks, was a surprise, as was the Red Priest and Priestess who were there waiting for Kinvara. He spoke to Ned as Frost and Leah rolled around on the dock and introduced Val, Kinvara, Sarah Lisser, and Ser Jeremy to Ned and Oberyn. After he did, they were taken to the Red Keep, though Kinvara left with the other 2 priests and told them she'd meet with his nephew another time. Hearing that Jon had been in some sort of dream state for the last few weeks and had only just awakened had him at first incredibly worried, though he was soon relieved when both Ned and Oberyn explained that he had recovered and just hadn't been able to come and greet them personally. Sarazier, 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 and the Loyalists were brought to rooms within the Red Keep and told that Jon would see them soon, while he and Val were taken to rooms closer to his family. Val walking around the Red Keep almost in a daze as she looked amazed at the sheer size of it. "This is where the king lives?" she asked as they walked to the family wing. "It is. We'll take you to him soon, Lady Val," Ned said, and Benjen saw Oberyn's smirk and Val's frown. "There are no ladies among the free folk, Ned," he said, seeing her nod to him. "Forgive me, Val," Ned said a little uncomfortably. "You're the Warden of the North, the Stark?" Val asked. "I am. And you?" she asked Oberyn. "Oberyn Martell," Oberyn said, dropping the prince bit to Benjen's surprise. When they reached what was to be Val's room, Benjen had to convince her that it was to be for her and her alone, and that he'd come by to show her more of the Red Keep and King's Landing in a bit. Val looking at him with what looked to be gratitude, and he felt a small stirring in his chest at the thought of doing something which made her happy. Ned asked if she needed clothing or wished to have a bath prepared. or if she was hungry, and Benjen found himself sensing the clear confusion that Val certainly was going through. The culture shock for him was something hard to get used to, but he at least had the experience of how lordship worked. For Val, having people do things for her would be much harder to get used to. Once she was in her room, Oberyn looked at him and gave him a very odd smile before bidding him and Ned a farewell. And Benjen followed his brother to his own room. Just looking around it when he got to it had him feeling just as strangely as Val surely was, and he began to panic just a little at the thought that this was his life from now on. "Ben," Ned asked, seeing his worried expression. "What? Sorry, this is hard to get used to," he said, taking a seat. I know. You can turn it down if you wish. Ben, there's always a place for you at Winterfell, and I'll be building up some new keeps, should you wish to run one. I'll speak to Jon," he said softly. Jay Harris," Ned said with a smirk, and he looked at him while his brother explained that his nephew had fully embraced the name his mother had given him. Benjen, smiling at the thoughts, how Lyanna would feel about that, were she here. "What happened to him?" he asked, as Ned poured him some wine. Benjen looking at it and scrunching his nose. "Had I known you were coming then, I'd have seen there was ale. We'll have some tonight, though. You'll eat with us, won't you?" Ned asked. Jon, Ned..." He listened as Ned told him what had happened and whether it was that his brother didn't truly know or that things were just that strange. He found that he was no clearer about the events than he had been before Ned explained. "And he's well?" he asked. "He is, a little stiff and not able to get around easily, but he's well and will recover fully." "Thank the gods," he said as he took a swallow of the wine, the taste starting to grow on him. "Val?" Ned asked. "She's here representing the king beyond the wall. Our nephew sent Kinvara to treat with them, and Val was sent by this king, this man's raider, to arrange a parley with Jay, he said. "A parley?" Ned asked, confused. "Val says there is an army coming for those beyond the wall, and when it's done with them, it'll come for the rest of us, an army of the dead," he said, expecting Ned to laugh only for his brother to say nothing and just look at him. After a moment, Ned got up from his seat and walked over before he patted him on the shoulder and told him how happy he was to see him. "It was close, and the Grand Maester says the babe will be born in the next few days. It's good to have you here for it, Ben. After dinner, we can speak some more. There's something I need to tell you about Brandon." "Brandon?" he asked, confused. "We'll talk later. I'll let you get settled," Ned said before leaving. He was in the process of doing just that, Benjen removing his clothes or what few he had, along with the even fewer possessions that he cared about, and was placing them in the drawers when a knock came to the door. Stopping what he was doing, he walked over to answer it and found Lors Tyrell standing there. The boy had grown a lot since he'd last seen him and was now wearing the white cloak of the Kingsguard. "Lord Benjen, his grace requests that you join him and her grace," Lord said, far more formal than he'd expected. "Of course, Loris, lead the way," he said. Walking with the boy, the formality soon fell away, and he was most relieved by it. The idea of having to speak in such a way all the time was not something that he had ever enjoyed. When they reached what he assumed was the king's chambers, Benjen could see the two Kingsguard that stood there, and he was happy to see Jay so protected. Without a word, the taller man knocked at the door, and it was opened by Queen Margaery herself. Benjen finding himself standing there, staring at his nephew's wife and just taking her in. She was incredibly beautiful, and the smile she wore only made her seem even more so. "Uncle Benjen," he heard Jay call out, and he looked to see his nephew sitting on a couch. Marjorie closing the door behind him as he walked over to join him and took a seat beside the new king. King's Landing, 208 AC. Robb, Iaji and Sansa were finally allowed to spend some time with Jatchier, as he recovered from whatever it was that he had gone through. Robb still unsure of what that was exactly. They made their way to his chambers, and he saw both Ser Arthur and Ser Loras to be on duty. Robb nodding to Loras before they were allowed into the room. Inside, Jat and Margaery sat on one of the couches. Robb quickly noticing the crutch that leaned against the wall, and he saw Arya frown when she saw it too. Do you need that? Are you not able to walk?" Arya asked worriedly, and Jay shook his head, bidding his sister come closer. Robb didn't hear what his brother said to her. He just watched as Jay spoke softly to their sister, his words going unheard to any but Arya and Margaery, who was sitting close by. He did see Arya nod a lot, and then throw her arms around his brother. The two of them staying like that for quite some time, while Jay rubbed her back and continued to speak softly to her. When Jay was done, he bid Sansa come to him and practically repeated the process. Robb happy to see there were more smiles and a little laughter when he spoke to Sansa. He took his seat and rubbed Ghost when he came near, the wolf almost checking that he and Arya were both alright before it walked over and lay down in front of Marguerite and Jay. After a few moments, Jay and Sansa broke from their hug, his sister wiping her eyes before she walked back to join him, and Arya on the other couch. I am well, a little stiff, and it'll take me some days or a week or two to be back to myself. Hence that. Jane said, nodding to the wooden crutch. Trust me, it's far more welcome than needing to be held up by Ser Arthur each time I need to move. Jane said with a chuckle. What happened? He asked, and saw Jira look to Marjorie. It's hard to explain, but I'll try. Jack said as he began to tell them what he'd gone through. He listened with both Arya and Sansa looking just as lost as he was. Jack speaking of magic and dreams and of seeing his family in Valyria. Robb wished to laugh out loud at the ridiculousness of it all, but found he could not. His brother was speaking so seriously that he knew it was true. Especially when he said that warging itself was just another kind of magic. Will it happen again? Sansa asked worriedly. I don't know, little sister, but should it then, you shouldn't worry. I promise no matter what. I'll always come back. Always. Jake said, and he saw Sansa nod. Why weren't we allowed to see you? Joy was but not us. Arya said, her voice angered. That was my choice. Yeah, I thought I was doing what was for the best. I didn't wish to worry you all any more than you already were. And as for Joy, she snuck in. It wasn't that she was allowed and you were not. Marguerite said, looking at them all. It's not fair, Yaz said, and he watched as Jade stood up and reached over to take the crutch, using it to walk over to them. Yaxlia's anger at not being allowed in to see him was soon replaced by worry. When she saw how Jane moved, Sansa quickly jumping up from the couch to help him over to them, and once he reached them, he knelt down and took Arya's hands in his. Sometimes life isn't fair, little wolf. Marguerite and the others thought what they were doing was for the best. Jane seared, and he found himself grinning when his brother moved his finger to Ar's mouth as she went to speak. Should it happen again then, we'll all know better, won't we? I'll be allowed visit, Sansa, and Robb too, Arya said, and Jay leaned over and kissed her forehead. I'll make it a king's order, shall I? Jack said, grinning at her, and Arya finally smiled. They had some juice and some fruit brought in, and he drank a little while, ignoring the food. Sansa and Arya must have still felt a bit hungry, or perhaps it was because the peaches did look quite delicious, as each of his sisters ate more than one. Jay joined them, and soon the conversation began to drift to far more pleasant subjects. His upcoming wedding, Arya's training, Sansa starting to officially be a lady-in-waiting. Fun though it was, and as much as he may have wished to keep the conversations to that, he knew that he needed to ask Jade the other thing that he came here for. Jade, my mother, he said, seeing Sansa and Margaery both suddenly wearing the exact same frown, while Arya bit her lip nervously. We've spoken of her, Robb. You know what is to happen? James said, his own tone much different now, too. I know, I'm not here to plead her case. I wish to speak to her, he said. Me too, Jack, please. Arya added, though Sansa stayed silent. You've not? I would have thought. Jay turned to Marjorie, who seemed just as surprised as he, his brother standing up and walking to the desk and grabbing some parchment and a quill. He wrote for some time before he looked over the words, and then blew on them to dry the ink and bid him come to the table. This will grant you access. I assumed you'd already been Robb. Forgive me for that. You can take as much time as you wish with her. Just show this to the jailer or to Sar Bonifer and his men, and they'll let you in. Thank you, Jay, he said, taking the note. Jay said goodbye to both his sisters with a hug and some whispered words before he nodded to him, and then, using the crutch, walked back to sit down with Marguerite. He bid them both his own goodbyes, and then he and his sisters walked from the room. Axlia looked eager to go to see their mother right away, while Sansa looked anything but. Should we do this now? He asked Sansa, not needing to get Arya's reply, but he was surprised by his older sisters. You both can go when you wish. I've no desire to see that woman. Sansa said, That woman is our mother, Sansa, Arya said before he could open his mouth. Yet, I can't seem to care, Sansa said, walking away from them both. Robb wondering if he should speak to her or not, and deciding that now was not the time. He looked down at Arya, who seemed to be on the verge of tears. Robb realizing that perhaps she thought this meant that they'd not go either. Do you wish to go now? He asked, and Arya nodded vigorously. Come then, let's go speak to Mother, he said, and took her by the hand. The walk to find one of Ser Bonifer's men was much longer than he had anticipated. Usually, the royal guard was everywhere, and yet, for some reason, there didn't seem to be any of them around. He'd almost given up hope that he'd find any when he saw Sir Bodder walking his way, and so he moved to get the man's attention. Sir Walder, Lord Robb, Lady Arya, been to see his grace, have you? Walder said, looking down on them both. Aye, we've been given permission to go and speak to my mother, sirs, but I can't seem to find one of the royal guard anywhere to take us, he said, hoping that the man he'd known for most of his life as Hode would offer to do just that. And finding out he was to be in luck. Then let me take you both, Sir Walder said. Robb soon found himself chuckling along with the large knight as Sir Walder and Arya spoke of training sessions and of Brienne being his squire, Arya, most keen on the idea of a lady knight. Robb was about to tell her that ladies can't be knights when Sir Walder told them both that it was only a matter of time until Brienne was dubbed so. Robb looking at the man to see if he was japing, he found that he wasn't, and Sir Walder explained what the duties of a knight and the code they lived by truly were, and how Brienne was just as deserving of it as any man. Robb looked and could clearly see the wide-eyed look Arya was giving him and the excitement she was clearly feeling as she listened to his words. Sir Maran? Sir Walder said when they reached some stairs. Sir Walder, the other knight said with a nod. Lord Robb and Lady Arya wish to spend some time with their mother, Walder said. Have they permission to do so, sir? Maran asked, and Robb handed him the note that Jay had signed the knight, reading it quickly before speaking to him. Follow me, Lord Robb, Lady Arya. They said goodbye to Sir Walder and followed the other knight down the stairs into a room with some guards outside it. Robb waiting impatiently as the doors were opened and they were led inside. His mother sat on her bed looking down on the floor, and he noticed how old and tired she looked almost immediately, before she even had a chance to look up at them or acknowledge their presence. He was almost brushed aside as Arya ran to their mother and threw her arms around her. Mother, I've missed you so much, Arya said as the guards left the room and her mother looked from his sister to him. Oh, thank the seven, Robb, Arya, thank the seven, their mother said, and the door behind him closed, shut. King's Landing 2098 AC. Ashura, she'd put it off for as long as she could. Yenna, Geryon, and the others all telling her that she needed to go and speak to the woman and tell her the truth about things that Ashura had felt she deserved to know. In the end, it was Oberyn who she went to for advice. Ashura having dinner with him and Illyria and his girls, while Geryon did the same with Jenna and Kevin and Cregan did with the Starks. She had to admit that sitting in a room that reflected Dornish culture was something she very much enjoyed. Illyria had almost immediately redecorated her and Oberyn's apartments to reflect Dornish rather than Lannister or Baratheon tastes. To eat the food from her homeland was something she enjoyed even more. The spices felt so familiar on her tongue, and the Dornish sour was more welcome than the Arbor Gold she'd become used to in the West. As for the company itself, Oberyn was his effusive self. And while she'd barely known Illyria from her time in Dorne, she could tell very quickly that had she then they'd have been firm friends. Oberyn's girls ranged from the studious Siblera to the warrior-like Obera and seemed to fit every single example of Dornish woman in between. Tyang was soft-spoken and seemed almost innocent. Nymeria was flirtatious and effervescent, and the younger girls all tried to copy their older sisters as best they could. Ashura had hoped that Arianne would have joined them too, but the princess was eating with what was soon to become her good family. Oberyn telling her that the dragons were having their own family dinner that night. You did not wish to attend, she asked Oberyn, knowing how much he thought of his adopted nephew. I wish for our own dinner with my nephew and niece, and given my girls, it's for the best we don't share our time. Oberyn said, his smile ever present as he looked down at the two youngest who were speaking animatedly to each other. Jay seems to be well, recovering well, that is, she said, taking a sip of the wine. My nephew is far stronger than he looks, and he also has more than one wedding that wishes his attendance. Oberyn said, leaning forward to kiss Illyria. Ashura smiled at that. She'd heard that Oberyn was to marry his longtime paramour, and it was clear to any who looked just how much he loved Illyria. That they'd not married before now she could only put down to Doran. Ilya's brother always having his own motives for each action he took, or did not. It will be in Dorne, she asked. Of course, the same week that Arianne is to marry, Illyria said, smiling. Then I look forward to seeing Sunspear once more, she said, smiling back, just as truly. They spoke then on days long past as they ate and drank, neither she nor Oberyn willing to hit upon subjects that brought up bad memories, and instead speaking on the ones that only led to good ones, Stories of their days at the water gardens and growing up as children, tales of Oberyn's mother and of her own. When they spoke of Aelai, it was of those days only, the young and carefree days when the world had not yet shown just how cruel and unforgiving it could be. Ashura welcomed the reminiscences. The warm memories of her friend were ones that she could look back upon with joy. But soon enough, they were being infringed upon by the memories that none of them wished to think about. Ellaria, noticing the change of mood and using her children to make them forget and place those memories aside for now, at least. Ashura was soon laughing loudly as Doria spoke of her own days in water gardens, and as Lorisa named her sister a coward for being afraid of the water where she was not. Nyani, Taiyen, take your younger sisters to their rooms. It's time they were abed. Ellaria said when the dinner ended and Oberyn looked her way. Mama, Yaya said, pouting. No, little snake, you have a busy day with your father on the morrow. Now go, or I'll make you stay here with me. I'm sure there is some embroidery I can find for you all to do. Ashura laughed at how quickly the girls moved after that. Oberyn telling her they were going hunting in the Kingswood on the morrow, and his daughters proving themselves truly their father's children, as they'd not risk that would not be the day to come. When the youngest were asleep, Sarella, Obara, Naim, and Taiyen came and bid their father and Ellaria good night. The girls soon leaving them alone as they headed out to enjoy what King's Landing had to offer, and Ashara found she envied them their youth. So what brings you our way, Ashara? Not that I'm unhappy with your company. Oberyn said, as he sat beside Ellaria on a long couch while she sat across from them and faced them both. Cordial Tully, she said, and saw the angered look that soon appeared on Oberyn's face. The trout, why care you about her? Oberyn said as Ellaria rubbed her fingers over his arm. The effect almost instantaneous as Oberyn calmed. I don't. I could care less about her, and was she not locked in a cell in the dungeons then, I'd not give her the time of day. But she is, and soon she's to face punishment for her crimes, and for what she tried to do to our nephew Oberyn. Were that enough, then I'd perhaps wish to speak to her, to give her a piece of my mind, but you know why I'm thinking of her, she said. And Oberyn nodded, though it was Ellaria who nodded. You wish to speak to her about Brandon, about Cregan? Ellaria said, I feel I must, she said softly. To explain? Why, you owe her no such explanation, Ash. He loved you and not her. Any with eyes to see would know that to be true, Oberyn said. He was betrothed to her. No doubt she thinks me a seductress, a wanton woman who lay with her intended, and as I said, were she anywhere but here, I'd care not, but here she is. And I'd have her know the truth before she faces her punishment for what she did. She'll not believe it, Ash. Lord Jaime told me that Stark went to see her and she thought he was there to rescue her, that he'd come to stand up for her after all she'd done. The woman has lost what little sense she has, Ash. Seeing you won't make her believe the words you speak, and you may risk her own hurting you far more than yours hurt her. Oberyn said, I don't wish to hurt her, Oberyn. I wish her to know the truth about me and Brandon, about Cregan. For whatever good it will do, I just want her to know, she said. And Oberyn shook his head while Ellaria nodded. Then you should go, but be wary, Ashara. As Oberyn says, the woman has lost her senses. You may not wish to hurt her, but she very well may try to hurt you, physically or worse with words alone. Ellaria said sympathetically. She bid them good night and walked back to her own rooms, checking in on Joy and Cregan once she got there. Her son asleep with his wolf at the end of the bed, and Joy with Billerine on hers. Jerian was sitting up waiting for her, and so she walked over and sat down on his lap, telling her husband what Oberyn and Ellaria had suggested, and she listened to him as he told her that, whatever she wished to do, he was with her. They made love, and he held her through the night. Sleep for her was hard to find, and when finally closed her eyes, she was awake. What felt like moments later, she rose and dressed before she broke her fast with her husband and their children. To Charlotte waiting until Joy went for her lessons, and Cregan had set off to spar before she told Jerian that she was ready to speak to Catelyn Tully now. He walked her down to the cells, and he waited for her as she was led inside. Then for the first time in 7 and 10 years, she was face to face with a woman she'd once pitied and who she now only scorned. Begin to cry. Jade's already not understanding and thinking that he'd hurt her. I'm sorry, gods, Margaret, I'm so sorry, he said over and over again, as she shook her head and kissed him and tried to find the words to tell him how she felt. It took some time for her to calm enough and for Jade to stop apologizing, the two of them laying on their sides and looking at each other face to face. You didn't hurt me, Jade, I swear it. You did anything but hurt me, she said, reaching out to rub her hand through his hair. Then what? You were crying, Marge. I saw it. I heard it. Jay said, his voice full of worry and concern. I think it was because a part of me feared that it would, she said, struggling to get the words out as he looked at her. What did I tell you? It's us, Marge, you and I. Always. Nothing will ever come between that. Not magic, not Bloodraven, nothing. You and me, together, always, he said, kissing her as she kissed him back. King's Landing, 2098 AC. Sarah Bonifer. He looked in the mirror, and the older man who stared back out at him was one he barely recognized. His thoughts having been confused ever since he'd looked into the glass candles with Daenerys, Bonifer would find himself looking at the princess and seeing not her but her mother. Knowing that it was only that Daenerys had a much different personality that had allowed him to not think of her as simply Roa, born again. As he dressed and looked at himself, he found himself closing his eyes, his fingers touching the place where only recently a gray beard had grown. Benifer shaving it off after seeing how he'd once looked, and now not sure if he'd been right to do so. The world he knew now and the world that had once been having almost merged into one, and he'd found himself looking and seeing ghosts wherever he walked. He saw the men who stood by and had allowed her to be treated so were now wearing white cloaks once more. Even though Jaime Lannister was not in Benifer's mind, it was hard not to see him in one as he did Arthur and Barristan. It was harder still not to feel anger when he thought of them and what they'd done and not done. When he looked at the princess and saw her with Oride Waters, it had been hard for him to see them both, and not see Aerites and Rhaegar, and at times he'd almost come close to running the man through. Bonifer walked from the looking glass and sat down on the bed, and before he knew what he was doing, he was laying back and picturing what he'd seen. The images in the glass candles were not like any memory he'd ever known, and instead had felt as real as if he'd been once again reliving the days. A few weeks ago, he and the princess walked to the king's chambers, both of them feeling equally as nervous as the other. Bonifer nodded to Sarah Walder, who opened the door, and when they walked inside, they found the king was already waiting. Daenerys greeted her nephew warmly, and he was happy to see it return the same way. Daenerys bidding them both to take and seat, and then picking up a chest from the ground. He looked on as he took the glass candles and a jar of what to Bond seemed to be blood, and placed them on the table. "You're both sure you wish to see this?" Yakshiris asked them. "I need to, Jack," Daenerys said as she looked at him. "Hi, I'm sure, Your Grace," he said. He watched as Yakshiris opened the jar and began to pour it on the green one while the black one was moved in front of him, and the princess, once it was almost covered in what he now was certain was blood, Jaehaerys looked to them both, and Born watched as the king closed his eyes and the flames began to light. A moment later, he almost fell to the ground when he saw the image began to appear. "I would ask for your favor, princess," the young knight said to a giggle from the silver-haired woman in front of him. "You are bold, sir, to think a princess would be willing to see her favor worn so publicly," the woman said. "Well, since we already have the boldest of knights, perhaps I'm just following in Sarah Barristan's footsteps, though. If memory serves me, he wished to ride for glory when I only wished to ride for love," the young knight said. "Oh, Bon, the words you speak," Rosiella said, smiling as she handed him the favor. "I speak the truth, my princess, my queen of love and beauty," he said softly. The images changed, and Bonifer saw that Daenerys was looking at him as much as she was at what the candle showed, her fingers brushing away a stray tear that had begun to fall from her eyes as she did so. The last man fell, and the crowd cheered as he rode over and picked up the garland before riding to the royal box. He could see the excitement in her eyes as he drew ever closer, and then he moved the lance so that it was facing her and her alone. "Princess Rola, I would name you as the queen of love and beauty." Bonifer felt Daenerys' hand touch his own as the images changed once more. His eyes focused on the glass candle as he wondered what it would show. Rhaegar stood in front of the looking glass, her white dress and small crown making her look like the maiden herself. She seemed to take a deep breath, and then the tears began to fall, Rhaegar moving to the bed and crying loudly as her body heaved. It was never to be him. It was never to be him. Come for me, my knight. Come and rescue me from what my life is sure to become. I need you, Bodden. I need you to come and take me from this place," Rosiat said as she began to cry, even louder. She was standing in front of the High Septon, and her distress and upset was clear for all to see. The man beside her paying her no mind. Rhaegar was doing her duty and marrying her brother as her father had demanded of her, and as the bells began to ring out, a lone horseman rode through the Kingswood. The horse changing direction and heading north now rather than south, it had been until the bell had rung out and made it clear. He'd been too late. He closed his eyes and didn't see the images change, only the sound of the pained gasp from the princess beside him forcing him to forego his own pain and concentrate on hers. As he looked to the king, he saw the sympathy in his eyes, and he welcomed the nod the man gave him before he turned to look down at the glass candles once more. "I will not stay here, Aries. I do not trust Pycelle, and I will see my child born." Rhaegar said, "You dare defy your king, whore. Do you forget your place?" Azir said, his long hair and nails showing just how close to the end this was. "We don't know where Rhaegar is and the rebels rise, Aerys. Dragonstone is safer for me and the children than here. Or do you wish to see yet another of our children not live?" Rhaegar said as Aerys slapped her hard across the face. "Don't ever speak to your king in such a way. You don't wish to wake the dragon, do you?" "No, but I'd see another dragon born, my love. Another dragon like you." Rhaegar said, her voice changing now. The boat sailed, and she stood on the aft looking as King's Landing faded from view, her belly swollen and her hands holding it tight. "You will live. By the gods, they'll all feel my wrath should you not." Rhaegar. The storm raged outside, and the screams rang out around the keep. Men and women running to and fro, and a worried-looking maester looking down at the pained woman in the bed. Her silver hair lay all across the pillow, and her hands gripped the sheets as the sweat poured down her cheeks. "I cannot be certain you will live, my queen. I can save you or the babe, but not you both," the master said. "My child, you saved my babe. You hear me?" "My queen, think about what you're asking of us," Sir Willem Darry said. "My child, Sir Willem, you save my babe. Don't make me order it," Rhaegar said. "You heard her grace," Sir Willem said. The sound of the babe's cries were heard over the storm, her violet eyes open and wide even as she cried out. On the bed, the woman was weak, and yet she reached out for the babe, and the maester handed it to her. As if all it had wanted was its mother's touch, the babe suddenly stopped crying, and Ra looked down at it, her strength almost seeming as it had returned to her, as she held the babe close. "Daenerys, my sweet, sweet Daenerys, look at you, so strong, so beautiful. I wish I could be there with you, to hold your hand, to see you grow into the proud, fierce young woman you'll surely be. Were it left to my will and my will alone, then nothing would stop me, but we all are here by the will of the gods, and the gods alone make that choice. Know this always, though, it was you I choose, and it was one of the only choices I got to make in this world that was mine own." "My queen," Sir Willem said, reaching out to take the babe. "Go, take them, go, Sir Willem, and know you do so with your queen's gratitude." Rhaegar said as Sir Willem took the crying babe and hurried from the room. Rhaegar turned her face from the door, her tears falling from her eyes as she looked out onto the bay, her breathing growing shallow as she turned her head back. "Look over them both, my son, my daughter, protect them, and let me see those that I wish to hold once more. Shamsa, Daeron, Aegon, Jaehaerys, Rhaegar. Your mother is coming home, Rhaegaress," as she breathed her last breath. The flames burned out, and Jack Sharts moved even quicker than he, the king holding Daenerys in his arms as she sobbed against her nephew's chest. He couldn't hear the words he spoke, but he did see the nod he gave him as he motioned to the door, Bonifer getting up and walking to it and sending Sir Gwalder inside, and then he, the king, and the giant Kingsguard helped Daenerys to her room. Now, he moved from the bed and wiped his eyes. The tears had come to him as they had at least once a day. Ever since he'd seen the images, the glass candles showed. It had taken Daenerys some time to come back into herself, and though she had, Bon had caught her looking to him occasionally with a sad look on her face. It was one that he was sure he'd worn often too. Getting up from the bed, he finished dressing and readied himself for the day ahead. He left the room and prepared to face the ghosts, and as he began to walk down the corridor and toward the princess's room, he did so with only one clear thought in his head. It was the same one he'd had since he'd seen the vision in the glass candles. Every time he thought back on the final words she'd spoken, he'd found himself more and more sure it was to him that she spoke. He'd not been able to protect her son, to look over him as she had wished, but he could do so with Daenerys, and he would. "I'll protect her, my love, my life for hers, and one day I'll see you again," he said softly, as he saw the princess smile as she walked from her room towards him. King's Landing, 2098 AC. Cat. For some reason, the dreams had stopped. Cat not sure why that was, but welcoming it all the same, and yet sleep still eluded her. At first it had been because she feared what may come to her when she closed her eyes, but then it had been because she feared what was to become of her now that she was in the dragon's lair. Each visitor only making her more and more certain that the dreams themselves would come true. She'd been furious when the Lannister had come. How dare she judge her for things she knew not? It hadn't been her family that the bastard had intended to usurp. No, her family had benefited from having him in their home, as he has yours. Kat shook her head and ignored the voice, just as she had done ever since she'd started to hear it speak to her. Ever since Jaime Lannister had come, it had become something that had been happening more, and when Ned came, it had only gotten even worse. Kat hearing the voice each time she brought up her reasons for hating Jon Snow in her head. He wanted to usurp Robb. Did he? He was a threat to my family. Was he? He is a bastard. Is he? The voice not agreeing with what she would say, and Kat hating hearing it, as it sounded more and more like her father or her brother, her uncle or her mother, and even Brandon from time to time. She was sitting in her cell trying to get the voice to leave her alone, when the door opened and Robb and Arya walked in. Kat welcoming the feel of her daughter's arms around her and looking up to see her son. Though when she looked behind him, she didn't see Sensei anywhere in sight. Arya never let go of her hand, even when Kat had her sit on the bed beside her, her daughter looking up to her lovingly while Robb bore a very different expression on his face. Kat sat silently as Arya told her about her fostering, and while she wished to speak out about it and how wrong it was that she was doing as she was, she felt at best she did not. Instead, simply nodding and letting Arya's presence be enough for her. Robb is to be married soon too, Mother. I hope you can come. Rosier said, and Kat looked to Robb, whose expression was telling her all she needed to know about that. Her presence would not be welcome, she could clearly see in that look. You need to admit what you did, Mother, to stand up and say you're sorry for it. Perhaps then, Robb said. You expect me to apologize to him after all he's done, she said, feeling Arya move from her. All he's done? Was it him who sent assassins after himself, Mother? He who tried to have himself killed because he feared what he may do. No, that was you. All you, Robb said. Robb, I did it for you, for Arya, for Sansa, for all of you, she said. And Arya looked at her and then her brother. You did it for me? I never asked it of you, nor did Sansa or Arya. Do you think any of us wished our brother dead, Mother? Robb said angrily. He would have taken Winterfell from you, she said, ignoring the voice, which said that he was king of Westeros, and Winterfell was a very small prize compared to that. Gods, do you even listen to yourself, Arya? Come on, there's not talking to her, Robb said. Rhaegar, please don't go, I'm sorry, She looked on as Arya moved to her brother, her daughter with tears in her eyes as Robb led her from the cell. Kat not sure what she'd done or said to make them leave. You tried to kill their brother and told them you did it for them. I did do it for them, she said to the voice, as the cell door closed. Did you? Her meal came, and she barely ate it, Kat instead laying down and falling asleep. The dreams that came were far more pleasant, and she found herself standing looking down as Robb sparred in Winterfell. Sansa came running up to her, with Arya beside her, both girls dressed in the prettiest of dresses and holding out their embroidery for her to look at. Show your father, girls, she said, turning to the tall, dark-haired man beside her, Brandon smiling as he cheered their son on and looked at what their girls had made. Beautiful girls, just like you both, and your mother, Brandon said as he leaned in and kissed her cheek. When she woke, it was to the cell door opening, and she looked to see the woman standing there, Kat almost rising to her feet when she heard her speak her name. Catelyn Ashar. The door closed behind the woman, and Kat took a good hard look at her. Irishar Day not looking as if she'd aged, but a day from when she'd seen them all fawning over her at Harrenhal. What do you want? She asked, looking at the woman. To speak some harsh truths, Ashar said. Of how you seduced Brandon and bewitched him, she sneered. You really didn't know him at all, did you? He was to be my husband, she said loudly. Yet he married me, Ashara said, and her words took her own away, but only briefly. You think I believe your lies, she said. Out of the two of us, I believe I'm the only one who speaks the truth, and the only one who's never tried to kill a child. Ashray said, Had I known of your own bastard, then it would have been him that I'd have seen dead. The slap was hard, and she went to rise to her feet, only to see Ashara reach for something at her hip, and she worried that the woman was carrying a knife of some sort. Instead, it was a handkerchief that was thrown to her, and Kat threw it to the ground, having no intention of using anything that belonged to this woman. Your father knew of my marriage to Brandon. He knew but kept it from you. He demanded that Rickard Stark annul it and force Brandon to wed you against his will. Whether you believe it or not, I care not, but I felt you were owed the truth. It was never to slight you or even about you. We met, we fell in love, and had things not turned out how they did. Then who knows what the realm would be like today. I told you I care not for your lies, Kat said, turning away from Ashara. You knew so little of his true nature, but you knew enough. How do you think he'd have reacted to being told what he must do, Catelyn? Do you really think there was a force in this world that could make Brandon Stark do anything but what he wished to do? You wrapped your legs around him and gave him what I would not until we wed. That's all you were to him. Ashara, a cheap whore that he could spend inside and father a bastard upon. Me, he loved, she said, and Ashara laughed. I was told you were deluded, so lost in your own fantasy that you'd not listen to what I had to say. It seems they were right, and I was wrong. Well, so be it. I know the truth, and perhaps one day you will too. Either way, it was me he loved, me he married, and me he had a child with. Catelyn, do with that what you will. When Ashar left, she began to cry, thinking back to those days and to how, while not cold, how inattentive he had been. Kat had been sure that he, like Robert, was sleeping with other women, but she was sure also that once they were wed, it would stop and be only here and him. It had never come to be. And as she sat there in the cell alone, she began to think that she'd never truly known what love had been. She'd not had it with Brandon, Ned, or with Pitare. The only true love she'd ever had was with her children, and she'd lost that because of how she'd felt about Jon Snow. Had you but loved him. The voice almost mocking her as she cried against the covers of the bed. The true depths of the situation she now found herself in, finally hitting home. King's Landing 208 AC. Jaehaerys Targaryen. Each day he felt stronger, and so he'd begun to welcome more and more visitors. Robb, Arya, Sansa, Joy, Willem, and Martin. Tommen, who was eager to get back to his duties, and Oberyn, Ellaria, and his cousins. He promised Oberyn that he'd eat with him and his family as soon as he was properly up and walking without aid. A woman named Gorman had said that would be in the next few days, and Jay found himself hoping they were right. With others, he spoke only briefly at Margaery's behest. Her own family, Jenna, Jerian, and Ashara, and even his uncle Ned were only allowed brief visits. Apart from Jaime, even his aunts and uncles weren't really allowed to spend much time with him, though in Shiera's case it was because Margaery still hadn't forgiven her for what had happened. Nothing, he said, could change her mind on it, and so he'd given up trying. Margaery saying that had she not acted how she had then, he'd have never fallen in the first place. Yadzeda wasn't completely sure that was the case, the words in Daenerys' journal becoming more and more clear to him. One line in particular kept playing out in his head as he read the journal over and over. Though he thinks she does it for him, in truth, she does so for you. It had made him think about events even more clearly. Shiera believed that Bloodraven had predicted what she would do if she saw the pin and had played her almost to do as he willed. Jera, though, wasn't as convinced. In fact, he was beginning to be certain that he'd instead just seen it and taken advantage of it. That he'd not actually planned it, but more he'd simply known it was going to happen. He spoke to Aemon one day about it, and his uncle told him something that he found most interesting. Marwyn always said that prophecy will bite your prick off every time. It's a treacherous woman, and like all things that are treacherous, it's to be handled with care. Anemone said. Ajaziel, though, had a different take on it, or at least when it came to himself and his role in prophecy, he did. There was truth, and then there was what people were allowed to believe was the truth. The line between one and the other was based not on knowledge, but on design. He'd come to believe Daxley's journal had been hidden. Why? Even when he found it, there was a blood lock on it. Why? As he looked at it, he'd known that he wasn't to be allowed to see the truth in it. Not then. Why? It's not for him to see. The thought came to him, and he knew it to be true. It wasn't for him to see. It was for Jane to see. It was locked because it couldn't be seen by someone who it hadn't been written for. And so, over time, people had taken fragments from it and thought them to be what was truly said. The prince that was promised would bring the dawn, he said, looking at the words in the book. But what exactly was the dawn? He looked over the words more and more as he tried to make sense of them, and then it hit him, and he found himself writing one phrase down over and over again on the paper. The lands eternal shall be renewed and open again. Valyria, he said as he began to read more. He shall conquer life, death, and then he shall bring about the rebirth. Conquer life. Was that beating Robert and regaining his throne? If so, then what did conquer death mean? And what exactly was the rebirth? death, life, rebirth. The dragon had 3 heads. Rhaenys, Valyria, rebirth. It was there. He could almost reach out and touch it, and yet it began to fade away. J.O. looking at the book and finding himself moving to other pages and watching as words began to appear. The doom comes for us all. Wolf and dragon, old and new, one king to unite them all. To go forward, you must go back. Love is strength. Jane found that certain phrases popped out at him, and yet the words around them almost seemed faded, as if now was not the time to know their truths. Instead, he found himself at the one other page that the writing was clear, and he began to read it aloud. Where the dragons make their lair amongst the salt and smoke, where the black stone fills the walls, the truth lies, and weapons are forged. Weapons of steel, of glass, weapons that can defeat death itself. The dragons know, they've always known. Jed said before he heard a cough from behind him. Jed, Marguerite said, and he turned to see his wife standing there, rubbing her eyes. Who were you speaking to? No one, I was just talking aloud, he said, closing over the journal and reaching for the cane. You let me sleep? She said, a little annoyed as he walked towards her. You were tired, he said as he kissed her cheek. I wanted to spend the day with you before the trial and before we needed to get back to being king and queen. I just wished to spend the day alone with you, she said, and he nodded. I know, but you needed to sleep too, Marge. You can't spend all your time looking over and making sure I'm well. It takes too much out of you, he said, looking into her eyes. I know, she said, and he kissed her softly, both of them growing equally annoyed when the knock came to the door. He turned to walk to it, but she brushed past him and opened it herself, and he was surprised to see Jaime walk in with a worried look on his face as he did so. Jaime, he asked. We need to talk, your grace, Jaime said. A few moments later, Marguerite and Jaime were walking to the reception room a few doors away. Jersey glad that Jaime had set him up in here. Monsieur Tirathar and Sir Barristan walked behind him while Ghost was in front of him, and he saw that Sir Betcherdhorp and Sir Walder were on guard at the door, along with almost a dozen royal guards. Far too many, he felt, for one man, even one as dangerous as Victarion Greyjoy. Sir Richard opened the door and Jane and Marjorie walked in. Ghost moving to stand between him and the Lord Captain of the Iron Fleet. He saw Shasta sitting beside her uncle, and how the man looked at the cane in his hand. The almost half grin that came to the Ironborn's face would be one he'd take pleasure in wiping off. First, though he needed to hear it from the man himself. Not that he disbelieved Jaime, but more so he could make it clear what he intended to do. Euron, he said, without taking a seat, intends to sail the Iron Fleet and attack Westeros. Victarion said. Where? He asked. I don't know. If I was to wager, I'd say the Reach, but I can't be certain. My brother's plans are changeable, and he has all the Iron Islands at his command, he asked. Along with pirates from the Stepstones, your grace, Asha said. Why should I believe you? He asked Victarion. I came because I heard you named my niece Lady Reaper. I hold no love for my brother, and with him in charge it will be worse for my people than it was with Bell and running things. Victarion said, If I find you're lying to me, Greyjoy, then I'll take pleasure in feeding you to my dragon, he said, as he looked to the man. Your ships will burn, either way, some, if not all of them, but if I can get to Euron first, then perhaps it will be fewer. He wants you to come. He has a horn, he says. It's a dragon binder. He wants you to come to him so he can take your dragon. Your grace. Asha said, and Jay began to laugh. Oh, I'll come, but the only thing he'll be getting from me or my dragon is fire and blood, he said, turning and walking from the room. King's Landing, 2098 AC. Jaehaerys Targaryen. As he struggled into his armor, he could feel his wife's eyes on his, and he had no need to turn around to know how angry she was. Jay wished he could say the words to calm that anger, but for now, he could not. Rhaenys had already begun to fly and would be landing in the dragon pit, and Jay would be going to her as soon as he was finished dressing. Nothing, not even his wife's anger, would stop him. Soon enough, he'd be flying to deal with Euron Greyjoy, the Ironborn, and this so-called dragon binder horn. But now he needed to fly and calm his mind. Normally he'd spar, him and Jaime, him and Loras or Arthur. He'd spar and speak the thoughts that filled his head, and a sense of calm would prevail. Since that was still not something he could do right now, or at least not with any semblance of strength or skill, he needed to fly. To add to how desperate he was to be in the air, Rhaenys' anger at the audacity of any man to dare claim that he would take her from him was fueling his own need to be with her. Jexi, finding that not even speaking to her through their bond was having an effect. She wished to be with him and he with her, and nothing or no one would stop him from doing so. "You can't leave?" Marjo said as Jay almost finished with his armor. "I have to," he said, not turning around. "So what, you're just going to fly off and try to find the Iron Fleet? You can't, Jay. You need to think about what you're doing. We need to speak to the council and come up with a plan of attack," Margaery said, and Jay stopped dressing and turned. Realizing that in his eagerness to be with Rhaenys, he'd not explained what he was about to do. He put the helm down on the chair nearest him and limped over, the cane sitting long abandoned in the other room. The closer he got to her, the more he could see that as angry as she was with him, the worry for him was what was truly driving her. When he reached her, he placed his hands on her shoulders and looked into her eyes, seeing the concern and also the determination that lay within them. Was it another time he'd perhaps have smiled, but he felt that wouldn't help things right now. "I'm not going after Euron, Marge. I need to fly to be with Rhaenys, and she needs to be with me." She felt it, heard it. What Victorian said about Euron's plans, "I need to be with her," he said, hoping his words made it through to his wife. "You swear to me, that's all you're doing, Jane. Swear to me that you're not flying off to attack the Ironborn with no plan," she said, looking deep into his eyes. "I swear it. I'm going to fly and I'll be back as soon as I can. We'll meet with the council and come up with a plan. I won't do anything before then, I promise," he said as she moved in closer to him. After holding his wife for a few moments and getting the decidedly uncomfortable feeling that he, in fact, hadn't really resolved anything, he turned, grabbed his helm and his sword, and walked from the room. Outside, Jaime, Arthur, and Barristan waited, and when he told them he was heading to the Dragon Pit, the arguments began once more. Jack stopping them in their tracks and ordering Jaime to arrange a small council meeting to be held on his return. Arthur and Barristan followed him from his room, and he looked back to see his wife and Jaime were locked in an intense discussion. As he walked through the Red Keep, he felt Ghost running his way, and he told him to go to Margaery, the wolf, doing so reluctantly. While he knew it was out of concern for him and what he'd gone through, and that he wasn't back to himself physically yet, he was frustrated by their concerns too. They knew him or should know him, well enough to know he wasn't reckless for the sake of it. There were things he didn't understand. He doubted anyone did, but they needed to give him the freedom to see them done, and to trust that he would do so. It seemed they allowed their worries to become doubts, and so he resolved to speak on things upon his return. For now, he walked from the Red Keep and was happy to see that Tommen had already saddled Winter. "Good work, Tommen," he said, mussing the boy's hair, as he leaned in and closed his eyes to feel the bond with his mare. "Do you wish me to ride with you, your grace?" Tommen asked. "Not right now. I'll be flying on the dragon, but we'll speak later, you and I," he said to a nod as he mounted up and rode from the courtyard. It didn't take them too long to ride to the Dragon Pit, even with the people stopping what they were doing to look at him. Arthur and Barristan as they rode by. She was already waiting for them when they reached it, and Jay felt the twinge that went up his leg when he jumped from Winter's back. The stiffness had not fully gone as of yet, and he knew this was partly why they were so concerned about him. Turning to the two knights, he prepared for the next argument of the day, and was surprised when he didn't receive as much of one as he'd expected. "I'll be flying alone, sirs," he said, looking to the two knights. "To where your grace?" Barristan asked. "I don't know. I need to comfort my sister and her. Me, I suppose. I won't be going after Greyjoy or further than perhaps Dragonstone." "I'd imagine," he said, and saw the look. Barristan shot Arthur. "Your word." "Your grace?" Arthur asked. "My word, Sir Arthur," he said as he began to move from the two knights. "Thank you," he said simply, before he covered the last few feet to his sister. He stood with her for what felt like the longest time, Jay leaning against her with his head touching her own. They didn't speak either in words or through their bond, both of them just content to feel the other's touch and to know they were together. Eventually, he climbed up on Rhaenys's back, and without words still, she took to the air. Jay almost feeling the calm come over him as they flew from the Dragon Pit and over the city. Rhaenys was soon flying over Blackwater Bay, and Jay was looking through her eyes at the ships below. A smile appearing on his face when he saw the Western Wolf sailing into the bay. Soon enough, Rhaenys was bored with flying so slow and so carefully, and so after checking that he was up for it, she began to have some fun. Jay laughed as the water splashed up as Rhaenys flew no more than a few feet above it, and then he felt the rise of his stomach as she pulled up and flew straight up into the air. He had to hold tightly to the ties of the saddle as she began to twist and spin. Rhaenyr's most keen to show off some new tricks that she'd picked up, and Jaime more than happy to share in her joy at doing so. After perhaps an hour or so of her doing dives, and at one point almost feeling to glide without a beat of her wings, as he felt some sort of wind push them forward, Rhaenyra turned and headed for Dragonstone. The island soon coming into view, and his sister taking him to a clearly uninhabited part that she'd taken as her lair. When he climbed down from her back, she took to the air once more, and he looked on as she flew down into the bay beneath them. His sister flying back some time later, having eaten and deciding that so should he. Jaxlier almost laughing as she looked from the burned fish to him and back again. His sister was in a playful mood, it seemed, and wasn't going to use her words to tell him to eat. He sat down beside her and ate some of the fish, Jaxlier feeling her eyes on him all the while, and only when he had eaten what she considered enough did they turn away. "I want to fly there, Jay. I want to burn each and every one of their ships. I want to show them what happens when you threaten a dragon," Rain said. "As do I, but we cannot, Marge, Aimee, and Aemon. They're all right, and I need to find out more about this Dragonbinder," he said. "He will not take me from you, not him and not that kinslayer beyond the wall. Not even the one spoken of in the journal and the drawings in Winterfell. None of them. We are bonded. Here you go. I go. Rosiette, where you go, I go," he said, reaching his hand out and placing it against her head. "Did it feel real?" Rhaenys asked, her voice soft as she spoke of the dreams. "Some of it, but it was wrong too. You were wrong. Egg, father, and Aedyat, and grandmother, and Viserys, you were all wrong. But then you were right," he said. "Right?" she asked, confused. "In King's Landing, what he showed me, that was wrong. In Valyria, seeing you all in Valyria, that was right," he said. Rosierne said nothing for a few moments. Jabe was now lying in front of her on his stomach, his head facing her own, which rested on the ground in front of him. The two of them just looking in each other's eyes, her deep purple meeting his own dark gray. "Do you believe it can be done? Truly?" she asked, her voice doubtful, but there was some hope in it too. "I believe that together we can do anything. Three heads, right, Jay? There's a reason why it had to be that, and why you and I could be the only way that it could be done." "We can see them again?" she asked, her voice rising ever so slightly. "We will see them again," he said, reaching out and rubbing his hand against her head. How long he slept for? He didn't know, but when he woke, he looked up to see she was still awake. And as he got up to stretch his legs, he looked around before he saw it. The cave opening was hidden, and yet not if one knew where to look. He turned to Rhaenys, and found her eyes were watching his every move. And when he started to walk towards the cave, he felt her approval. Jack soon enough entering into the darkness and being stunned at what he saw when the light finally shone through. The flight back to King's Landing was far faster than the one to Dragonstone had been, or perhaps it was the excitement he felt at the discovery he'd made. Jay barely noticing when they landed in the dragon pit, so distracted was he by what he'd seen, and only when Rhaenys almost pushed him from her back did he realize where he was. He climbed down and spoke to her once more, telling her that soon they would fly and deal with Euron, with Bloodraven, and with the other, and then they'd fly home once more. King's Landing, 2098 AC. Sir Richard Lonmouth. Speaking to the man they held prisoner was an exercise in futility, his denials, claims of being leal, and what he assumed to be subtle attempts at both bribery and manipulation, all falling on deaf ears. That his men were loyal to him, even above coin, meant he had no need to worry about Littlefinger turning any of them. As for his sailing companions, the man himself had put paid to either of them coming to his aid. Wyman had a dislike of Littlefinger that had taken Richard aback due to its ferocity. The Lord of White Harbor explaining to him when he'd asked him about it why that was, and Richard feeling somewhat shamed that he'd not thought of it before he'd asked. "He tried to kill my king, Richard, paid a man to see him dead. That said man happened to be in your employ, and the plot doomed before it begun matters not. He tried to kill my king." We'd said, "Aye, but that's not all, is it?" he asked curiously. "No, were Jay Theory's just my king then, I'd feel this way. Were he just the son of my liege lord, I'd feel it too. But look at me, Richard. Look at me and tell me what you see. Not what you know, mind. What you see. What they all see, Wyman," he said softly. "Hey, true enough. Same as what they saw when they looked at a bastard son of the Lord of the North. He never saw that in me, and while it's true, I saw more in him than others, no man saw the truth of me as well as Jack Juris did, master of trade, pinnacle ships, my granddaughter soon to be the wife of the heir to the north. I could never have risen so high under any other king. So no, it's not just that he's my king, it's that he's who he is, and that sparrow of a man tried to kill him. Mockingbird, Richard said to a laugh. Whatever. He's soon enough to have his wings clipped. Webben said, laughing still. As for Willis, well, Littlefinger pulled on the wrong thread there, and were it not for Ryland's quick action, then his king wouldn't be getting a live prisoner to try. Richard, having found himself called to ensure that the Master of Coin didn't impale Littlefinger with the sword he carried in his cane, when a mention of Sansa Stark had been made. The Mockingbird getting away with a cut on his cheek rather than a cut throat. Had Ryland not moved quicker, that would have been what he'd got. What did he say? He asked Ryland. The Lord came to him, and Littlefinger offered him coin for the crown, said he had access to almost 1,000,000 gold dragons, and he'd give it all to the crown if Lord Willis would intervene on his behalf and see him keep his head. And he stabbed him from that? He asked, shaking his head. No, he began to speak of Lady Catelyn, and then made mention that he wagered the daughter tasted even sweeter than the mother had. How Wills was a lucky man to be betrothed to such a beauty, and that having knowledge himself of how sweet a tolly could taste as it was ripening, that he knew how Willis would feel as he took her maidenhead, just as he himself had felt as he had taken her mother's and her aunt's. Ryland said, "You should have moved a little slower," Richard said, before shaking his head at the confused look on Ryde's face. He'd gone to speak to Lord Willis, and found the man stewing in his anger as he paced the deck. Richard waiting until he noticed him before moving closer. Willis had been still gripping the handle of the cane tightly, and the last thing he wished for was to be accidentally stabbed. The idea of dying after being mistaken for a mockingbird was not the end he had envisioned for himself. "It was for the best you were stopped," he said, as Willis's head snapped toward him. "You're lucky I've not more men with me, Sir Richard. Else I and they would be taking his head, and none would stand in my way." Willis set his lips tight as he tried to keep a lid on his emotions. "It's for the best you were stopped, Lord Willis, especially after what he said to you," he said. And Willis stopped moving across the deck and looked to him. "Why?" the man asked curiously. "You know how much the king loves his sister. What do you think he'd do to him, knowing what he said?" "He'll kill him anyway. How is that more punishment than what I wish to do?" Willis asked. "Because unlike how you wish to do so, the king won't be as merciful," he said, turning to walk away. "You think he'll not just take his head?" Willis called out after him. "I think that'll be the last of it if the man is lucky, and trust me. Lord Willis, that man's luck has all run out." The days stretched on, and they passed by Clarisle and then Dragonstone, and finally were sailing into Blackwater Bay, Richard standing on the deck as they did so. He looked up to the mast and smiled to see the Eagle resting there. It had joined them a day or so out of Braavos, and made itself a nest among the sails. As he looked up, he saw an even more pleasing sight, and soon enough, he was not the only one watching, as Rhymdix flew with the king on her back. Both Wyman and Willis joining him as they watched the dragon drop to the water and fly low across its surface. Richard almost hearing the laughter that he knew was coming from his king. When they reached the docks themselves, it was to Sir Walder and Sir Jorah along with a large guard, and Richard gave the nod to Ryland to bring their prisoner and ready him to be transported to the cells in the Red Keep. He walked down the gangplank and could sense something was wrong when he saw Sir Walder's face, the large man quickly telling him that a meeting of the small council had been called and that the Ironborn needed to be dealt with once more. "Take him to the cells. Only my men of the 100 or Kingsguard to watch him. Not even a servant is to be allowed to see him. I'll join you later," he said to Ryland as he began to quickly move through the streets. It took him some time to reach his building, and they were all surprised to see him, Richard sparing no time for courtesies and instead asking to see every message they had for him. The pile of scrolls was soon in his pack as he left and hurried to the Red Keep. Again, he spared no time for courtesies and didn't even head to his solar, moving straight to the small council chambers to ready for the meeting ahead. Once inside the room, he asked for water to be brought and took his seat. It would seem that he had much reading to do before the king and the others arrived. King's Landing, 2098 AC. Olenna, hearing that Jaime had just taken flight on his dragon, had Olenna scrambling and trying to think what to do. Her first instinct, the one she went with as she headed straight to her granddaughter, knowing that she'd be upset. When she reached the rooms, she found that while Marjorie was clearly worried, it was anger and annoyance that she was letting show for now. Her granddaughter speaking things about the king that would lose anyone else their head. Of all the stupid... Who does he think he is? I should have ordered to have him chained to the bed. Margaery's words made her chuckle inside as she knew they were merely her frustration shining through, and they stirred up memories of her own times with Luther. Her granddaughter not realizing just how lucky she was that her husband's own stupidity wasn't something that was beyond his control. She allowed her to keep speaking out, not correcting her or telling her she was wrong. Olenna finding that she agreed with her more than she disagreed with her anyway. While she had no true understanding of what it was that Jay had gone through, she knew he was not yet recovered, and so he should be resting and not flying off on a dragon.
Did His Grace say when he'd return?
She asked after feeling that she'd allowed her granddaughter speak long enough. Of course he bloody didn't. Why would he tell me that? I'm only his wife. Margaery said as she sat down on the couch. A little too firmly. He will be back today, though, she asked, and Margaery nodded. He's arranged a meeting of the small council to discuss the Ironborn and Euron Greyjoy and what's to be done, Margaery said. Then perhaps we should discuss what it is we can do before then, she said, and Margaery looked at her confused. Olenna glad it was her annoyance with her husband and not her being her father's child that was causing that confusion. We need to send ravens and prepare the realm for an attack. Old Town, the Arbor, and the Shields, the North, the West, and Dorne. Margaery said, Olenna smiling at just how quickly she'd managed to change her focus. Dorne, she asked, confused a little herself. Prince Oberyn and Princess Arianne are here, and Dorne suffered losses in the war in relation to some of their lords and best knights. I don't know how strong they may be without them, but a weak target is always a tempting one, Margaery said, and Olenna wondered how she came to that conclusion. Only for Margaery to answer her unasked question. Jane's been teaching me tactics. She found herself smiling at that, and even more so a few moments later, when Jane's Squire Tommen Waters arrived carrying news that the Western Wolf had docked and Willis, Lord Wyman, and Sir Richard had returned. We should speak to your brother, Your Grace, Olenna said when the boy left, and Margaery nodded. Willis took far longer to arrive than she'd thought he would, and she wondered if he'd gone to speak to Sansa Stark first before putting that idea from her mind. Her grandson may care deeply if not actually be in love with the girl already, but he was much too dutiful for that. Olenna listened as he told them they'd secured the gold in the Iron Bank and a trading deal that Lord Wyman would explain further. Then a moment later she was smiling broadly when he told them they'd also captured Littlefinger. Without incident? Margaery asked. Not without incident, no, but a story for another time. What's this? I hear about the Ironborn, Your Grace. Margaery explained it briefly before there was a flurry of activity. Olenna catching the glances that Sansa Stark and Willis shared when the girl arrived at Margaery's behest. Soon there were notes being written and sent, and Olenna and Willis took their leave and allowed Margaery to do what needed to be done. By the time Jaehaerys arrived back, the day was almost at an end, and dusk was about to fall over King's Landing. Olenna, though, finding that was not to be a barrier to the meeting that was to be held. After some brief refreshments, she made her way to the small council chambers, and was surprised by just how full it seemed to be. Prince Oberyn and Sir Richard, who had some paper on the table in front of him, Lord Wyman, Grandma, Aster Gorman, Sir Barristan, Benjen Stark, Randall Tarley, Lord Montford, Lord Jaime, herself, and Willis. Olenna took a seat before rising when Jay and Margaery walked in with Sir Arthur and Ghost alongside them. Sir Arthur carrying a chest and then placing it on the table in front of Jay's seat. Shall we begin? Jay said as he bid them all take their seats. Olenna looked to see that he and Margaery both seemed to be in a far better mood, and she smirked as she wondered, had they settled their differences with words or actions? Shaking her head a moment later, when she realized that was her granddaughter she was thinking of. Whatever form their reconciliation had taken, she was relieved to see them both now show a united front. Sir Richard, it's good to see you back. I take it all went well, Jade said, and Richard turned to look at the king before answering. It did your grace, Lord Baelish currently resides in the dungeons and awaits trial, Richard said. Excellent work, Sir. Lord Wyman, Lord Wellis, I trust your own time in Bravos went just as well as Sir Richard's, she asked. It did your grace. The Iron Bank now holds a little over 3,216,000 gold dragons in the crown's name, Willis said, and Olenna turned to see that Jackson's and Lord Jaime both seemed unsurprised by this. Lord Wyman, Jack asked, I have concluded a deal with the Iron Bank that allows us access to their trading routes with Uate, Corse, and Slaver's Bay, Wyman said. Olenna listened in eagerly, as the thoughts of the crown being solvent for the first time in years, along with the increased trading opportunities, both bore well for her granddaughters and future great-grandchildren's futures. There was some more talk which she felt was unneeded, but Jackson to be getting all the other business out of the way before moving on to the main issues. Something was said about wildings and red priests and some people named Val and Kinvara that she wasn't too fussed about. Is there anything else we need to discuss before we move to the pressing matters at hand? Jay asked, and she was relieved to hear no one bring anything else up. She, like the others, looked on as Jay reached into the chest and took out the glass candles before placing 2 black ones on the table to either side so that all could see. He then reached into the chest again and took out a jar before spilling some of the blood on the green one. Olenna wrinkling her nose at the image. Each of them looked on eagerly and were then all just as confused as each other when Jay closed his eyes and the images appeared. Olenna soon saw what appeared to be piles of rocks and then watched as the images began to change. Docks, islands, the sea, all of it was practically empty, bar small ships. "That's Pike," she heard Jaime Lannister say, and she looked at the image to see a few small ships, but nothing that resembled an iron fleet. "Have they already left? Are we already under attack?" Marjorie asked as Olenna watched Jade stood and began to look confused at the candles, and then the images changed rapidly. It took some time, and when he eventually sat down, he wore a worried frown on his face. Jay, looking perplexed as he stared at the glass candles without saying anything. She, like the others, were briefly worried when he closed his eyes and the images faded from the candles, Olenna relaxing only when she saw that Marjorie wasn't concerned. Though soon enough that relaxation was gone, when Jay opened his eyes and seemed to be even more confused. "I can't find them," he said, shaking his head. "Why can't I find them?" She was about to say something when Marjorie beat her to it. Olenna sitting with a proud look on her face as her granddaughter put them to work on the plans she'd come up with earlier. She herself surprised by how well thought out they were. When she then saw Jane's smile replace his frown, she became ever more certain that they worked far better as a partnership than either did alone. "Grandmaster, you've sent the ravens?" Marjorie asked. "I have your grace to Lord Lytton, Lord Redwine, and to the Lords of the Arbor, to Winterfell, White Harbor, and Bear Island, and to Lannisport, Tasterley Rock, and Fair Castle. Also to Starfall, Salt Shore, Lemonwood, and Sunspear." Gorman said. "You think he'd be stupid enough to attack Dorne?" Oberyn asked incredulously. "I think Dorne's leaders are here, and those his grace sent to the wall have not been fully replaced yet, Prince Oberyn." Marjorie said. "Your grace," Oberyn said with a nod to Marjorie. The smile on Jade's face was almost beaming as Marjorie spoke, and she saw him look to Lord Yaney before he looked to Marjorie, and then joined in. "Lord Monward, speak to Lord Kevin and begin organizing the fleet to set sail. Lord Kevin will ensure our own ships have a pinnacle ship as an escort. And before you both leave, come and see me. No one sails without a bird." "No one, is that understood?" Jade said, and Monford nodded, getting up to leave when he was bid. "I could perhaps begin to organize the Reach's defenses, Your Grace," Randyal Tarley said, and the man was lucky he was not in her line of sight. "I'll speak to my Warden of the South once this meeting is finished. Lord Tarley, perhaps you can join us both then." Jade said, and Olenna looked over to see Willis smirk. "Of course, Your Grace," Randyal said as he moved from his seat and walked from the room. "Uncle Benjen, Lord Wyman, I'd ask you both to speak to Lord Stark and ready the North even further. Speak to Lady Meg H2. Jane said, and the 2 men nodded before rising. "Uncle Benjen, perhaps we can speak later, Val and Kinvara also." "Of course, Your Grace," Benjen Stark said as he walked from the room. It left her, Marjorie Jay, Oberyn, Jaime, Gorman, Sir Barristan, Willis, and Sir Richard in the room. Jay turning to Sir Richard next. "Your lips," Jay asked, "speak no tales of where, Your Grace, nor when. Instead, it's tales of pirates in the stepstones of Victarion Greyjoy, Euron's cruelty, and little else," Richard said. "How bad exactly is this Euron?" "Sir Richard," Marjorie asked. "The worst of the worst, Your Grace," Sir Richard said. "Uncle, perhaps you can write some messages for those in Dorne that you trust best to make ready." "I'll see them sent," Jane said, and Oberyn nodded. "At once, Your Grace," Oberyn said as he moved from the table. "Jaime, the West," Jane said, and Jaime nodded. She watched as Jay rose and put the glass candles into the chest and closed it up before he turned to look at them all. As much as the preparations we make are needed, I know all of you are thinking it, and so I'll tell you why the dragons may or may not be of help here. According to Victarion, Euron possesses a dragon binder. Now I've asked Aemon and Cirella to look into all mentions of it, and until they do, I don't know how effective the dragons may be. So for now, we act as if there are no dragons. Jack said, "Your Grace," she said, as did the others. "There are other things that need to be handled to do with Lady Kinvora and the Free Folk woman, Val, and to do with my visit to Dragonstone. However, you all have enough to concern yourselves with in relation to the Ironborn. So I'll ask you to forgive my secrecy on those matters for now, and I will as soon as I am able to share them with each of you," Jay said, and Olenna watched as he placed his hand on Jaime Lannister's shoulder, bidding him stay as the rest of them rose to leave. She was in the process of doing so herself when Jack stopped them and caught them all by surprise, bringing up something that she'd expected would have been the last of his concerns. Though given who it involved, perhaps she shouldn't have been so surprised. "I have no idea of what time frame we'll be forced to adhere to. For all I know, in a day or two, my aunts and my uncles may be taking to the skies and setting off somewhere in the realm to deal with the Ironborn and Euron Greyjoy. Or perhaps on this fight I and the dragons will be forced to sit it out. With that in mind, I've no choice but to see something done far more quickly than I would have wished, and so I'd ask you to put forward your suggestions for judges on the morrow. Before the weekends, Lady Catelyn Baelish is to stand trial," Jack said, turning to Marjorie and nodding. "King's Landing 2098 AC. Kinvara, she had to admit the work that Thoros and Melisandre had done already was incredible. The warehouse almost completely converted and done so enough that it was soon attracting worshippers. Kinvara knew that more priests and priestesses would soon be on their way, especially since Rhaegar was finally getting a foothold in Westeros after years of trying. Thoros had been sent to convert the king, and that had been a mistake. The man was not for converting, and even had they been successful, she shuddered to think. Yaxiorus was her god's chosen, and even though he himself didn't pray to R'hllor, he had already lived up to promises he'd made to Melisandre. By allowing them to open their temple, the rest would come in time. People would see the works that R'hllor did and compare them to the works of the false gods. And while not all would kneel, enough would Kinvara, knowing that the faithful would be needed in the war to come just as she and her fellow priests and priestesses would. It was easy for her to be patient and wait for the prince to call. It had already taken her more than 10 years to wait for her chance to serve. Rhaegar's chosen directly, and a few more days were no problem after that. So she sat and waited, and when the call came, she readied herself to go to the Red Keep. Melisandre and Thoros had their parts to play. Hers was to bring together his chosen and the men and women beyond the wall. It was something she'd almost done. The children, the free folk, bringing vows here, and soon enough the prince would go there. The ride to the Red Keep was quiet, and she looked around as darkness fell. The night is always causing her a moment's concern. She had seen in the flames the visions of what faced them should the prince fall. The night without end that would cover the entire world in darkness. Kinvara, trying her best not to remember the blue eyes the visions had shown her, that lay waiting in the darkness. Instead, as they reached the Red Keep and she walked through the corridors towards the king's rooms, she found herself speaking aloud. For the night is dark and full of terrors. She nodded to the two guards in their white cloaks and was allowed into a room, seeing Val Benjen Stark, and another man who she felt was related to him. There was a silver-haired woman who wore a ruby much like her own, alongside a man who wore a far more elaborate one. Kinvara, taking her seat and seeing Prince Tyrion sitting and speaking to Lord Jaime and another silver-haired woman, this one younger than the other, James Varys and his queen were nowhere to be seen, and she sat silently while the others spoke. Smiling when she saw them both walk in after a few moments. "Forgive the wait," the queen said as she held her hand out to bid them sit. When they began to rise, "Has everyone here been introduced?" Yaxley asked, and she found some eyes looked to her, while the others seemed to have at least been told who each person was. The king and queen sat and she waited to see who was to speak first, noticing for the first time some papers in the king's hands, which she looked curiously at. Lady Kinvara is a priestess of Rhaegar, and was recently beyond the wall at his behest. Or was it mine? I find I'm not quite certain. Yaxorus said with a smirk. "Both my prince," she said with a nod, and saw some frowns at her choice of words. "Val, my uncle tells me you're good sister to the king beyond the wall." "Mance Raider, is this true?" Jacrius asked, and Val nodded. It is, and you bring word from him regarding my offer. I bring a letter from Mansurator, my prince, she said, interrupting the conversation and handing him the letter. She watched as he read the note and smiled before handing it to his wife, who frowned a little and then handed it to Jaime Lannister, and then on to the others. We do not kneel, indeed, Jaxley has, as the note was read by his uncle, and he looked directly at Val. It's our way. We're free, and we wish to stay that way. Val said, glaring at the king. He'll not ask you to kneel either, Val, though the price he'll ask of you will be far steeper than the one I will. The king said, do all you fucking kneelers take so fucking long to get to the point? Val said, and Kinvara heard the king's chuckle as he turned and said something to his wife, who laughed a bit louder. Val, glaring at both of them now, forgive my husband. He was just saying how much he wished the rest of the realm cared so little for niceties. Marguerite said to last Val's, now relaxing some. She watched as Jaehaerys drummed his fingers on the table before opening up the papers and handed them out to each of them. Kinvara looking eagerly at the one she was given, and then almost shrinking in her seat when she saw they all showed the same thing. Men, children, beasts, all moving against the things with blue eyes, and the one in the middle of them all was bearing a white sword facing off against another who held what looked to be a bright yellow one. Both wore crowns, one of ice and the other fire, and Kinvara looked to see the king was looking directly at her. What is that? Tyrion asked. Jay? The young silver-haired girl asked, her voice strained. That's a song being sung, the Song of Ice and Fire, and that's how I bring the dawn. Jaehaerys said, she listened as she was told of images drawn on a wall in a cave on Dragonstone, and of weapons that could defeat the dead. Kinvara taking it all in without question, while the others did not, and soon the questions that came flew from all directions. How could he know this? What does this mean? Who was the figure he fought? Why did it have to be him? When was the fight to happen? The answers didn't come close to quietening the voices, and when the king stood up and slammed his hand down hard on the table, even Kinvara was shocked by the action. It did at least have the effect of stopping people from talking over themselves. She saw Jaehaerys look to the silver-haired woman and man who wore the rubies, seeing both of them nod. He then looked to Jaime Lannister and to his wife before finally looking to Benjen, and the man she knew now was Ned Stark. This fight is coming. What I don't know, and as for why it's to be me, it simply is. It is going to take every single one of us, all our dragons, all our men, all our knowledge, and so, starting tomorrow, I'm ordering work to begin on Dragonstone, to mine dragonglass, and have it forged into any weapon we can make for it. Arrowheads, spear points, knives, axes, anything we can make using it, we need to see it done, Jaehaerys said. And my people? Val asked, looking to the king. Your king suggests a parley, then it's a parley I shall give him, if an agreement can be reached. And since he's not already outright turned down my offer, I feel one can. Then after that parley, I'll begin moving your people through the wall. Jaehaerys said. Your grace, to where? Benjen asked, and Jaehaerys looked at him and his other uncle. It seems the future seat of Queen's Crown is about to get an influx of people, uncle. A rather large influx of people. Kinvara was asked to stay when the others took their leave, once they had Jaehaerys turn to her and asked her about her time beyond the wall and about her impressions of Mance Rayder. She told him that she believed the man to be true and that he wished the best for his people, and it seemed to be what he wanted to hear. As she herself got up to leave, she stopped and turned to him and spoke on the children of the forest and of the man they served. You met them? Yahtzee asked. One of them, my prince, Leaf. She was sent by this man, this three-eyed raven, to stop me from making it to the free folk, she replied. She tried to kill you, Margaery asked. She did, your grace. Rosier protected me and showed her the light. We were then brought to a weirwood tree and made to eat the sap from inside of it to blind the raven to our intent. Kinvara said and saw how keenly Jaehaerys was looking at her. The raven, did you see him? Jaehaerys asked. No, my prince. Leaf went back to him and the rest of her people, and we traveled on to meet with the free folk to continue our mission, she said. Do you have any idea where he is? Jaehaerys asked. Leaf mentioned a large weirwood in a grove. My prince, she said, and saw him nod. Thank you, Kinvara, for all you've done. Rosier tasked me with serving his chosen. My prince, I did only as was bid of me, she said. I thank you all the same, he said to her as he turned to his wife to speak to her, and she walked from the room. She felt a great sense of accomplishment as she was escorted back to the temple. She'd brought his chosen and the free folk together, and they would take a large piece of the potential forces they faced away from the great other. Kinvara did not wish to imagine some of those people who, while she'd not grown to love or care about, she did like, and she had no desire to see them look upon her with blue eyes. "For the night is dark and full of terrors, but I walk in the grace of his light," she said as she walked from the Red Keep. King's Landing, 2088 AC. The trial. Jaime, he, Oberyn, Genna, Garayan, Olenna, all of them wished to be the ones to sit in judgment, and yet none of them had been chosen. Jetty having thrown them all with who he decided to name as judges for the trial, and with his reasons for doing so. That wasn't the only thing which he'd thrown them with this morning either. Jaime thought as he dressed. It had been a surprise, and yet it really shouldn't have been to him. J.A. telling him what he intended while they sparred, or to be more precise, while they spoke instead of sparring, his strength still not fully back yet. "You don't wish to be there?" Jaime asked as they moved with the swords, both of them moving as one, but not clashing. "The last place I wish to be is in a room with that woman." Jane said before stopping his movements, "Is it not better that I'm not?" "For who, Jay? For you or for the crown?" he asked as Jay began to move once more. "Am I not the crown?" Jay asked with a smirk that brought a chuckle from his lips. "There are some who may see it as you ducking your responsibility, others who will see it as you backing down from a difficult choice." Jaime said, telling him the harsh truth of his decision. "And those who know me," Jay asked, "will understand," he said. "I fear what I'd say, me, what I may do, so let people think what they will. I know my reasons and my mind on this, and that's more than some of the kings who sat the throne did when they made their decisions." Jay said, his hands moving a little faster now as he focused more on his sword than anything else. Finishing dressing, he placed the pin on his chest and walked into the other room to find Daisy and Joanna already waiting. His wife smirking at him as if to mock him for how long it took him to dress. Joanna looked as if she was going to a picnic and not to see a woman tried for attempting to have a child, not much older than her, killed. Jaime had allowed Daisy to decide if his daughter should go or not. He knew that other fathers and mothers would be making the same choices elsewhere in the keep, and he was actually happy that in the end she would be going with them. "Shall we?" he said, taking his wife's arm in his while Joanna reached her hand up and looked to him. "Swing, Papa," she said, and he smiled as Daisy nodded before he bent down and swung Joanna around in a circle, her laughter ringing around the room, quickly making the day seem far less taxing than he knew it would be. They walked to the throne room and found they were amongst the last to arrive. Jaime looking around to see Ned and Benjen Stark standing with Ned's children and Garion standing with Ashara and Cregan. Oberyn was with his own children while Lena stood with Willis and nodded at him when she caught his eye. The Targaryens all stood off to one side, and Jaime could see the lords who'd not yet headed back to their respective kingdoms were all present. The River Lords in particular had been asked to attend, as had the Vale Lords. Both regions were the least likely to come under attack by the Ironborn, and in the River Lords' case, they more than any had a vested interest in the trial to come. The hush when Lady Catelyn was brought into the throne room was one he'd only ever experienced a few times, and he'd rather not dwell on any of them. Instead, he reached down and picked Joanna up and held her in his arms, preferring to see her face than the face of the woman who stood in front of them. That she'd aged somewhat and her hair was starting to gray was no surprise, as Jaina had told him after she'd visited that she resembled Lysa Tully far more than ever now. Jaime looked to see Ned Stark, who was looking anywhere but at the woman. He had once been married to their children together, though all stared at their mother with varying looks on their faces. Saints' one that showed she'd already judged her and found her guilty, while her other two children didn't look any more favorably upon her. Jaime felt some sympathy for them, though it was the boy who was not present that he felt it for even more. He looked around the room as Sir Richard stood forward, and he saw Sir Giers was standing beside a woman and two children. The Kingsguard not wearing his white cloak for once, and it took him a moment to realize that the people he stood next to were Allers's family. Jaime wondering when Jaime had sent for them and how he'd not known of it, and then looking to Sir Richard and realizing he was probably the reason, and that the man was now ready to speak. "We are here today to stand in judgment of Lady Catelyn Baelish and to ascertain her guilt or innocence in the crimes of conspiracy to murder, attempted murder, and murder itself. That these crimes were against his grace, King Jackers Targaryen, the third of his name, King of the Andals, Rhaegar and the First Men, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms, and Protector of the Realm, only further enhancing their vile nature. To offer judgment today, Lord Wyban Manderley, Prince Tyrion Targaryen, and Lady Ellaria Uller, Sir Richard said. He looked on as Wyman, Tyrion, and Ellaria walked out, and took up their seats, Tyrion dressed in black and red and looking every inch a dragon, while Ellaria wore her own house colors, tinged with a nod to House Martell. The bright yellow sun standing out on her crimson dress and making her look like she'd walked from the very flames themselves. It was the first time he'd ever seen her wear the colors, and he wondered if she'd done so deliberately this day. Jaime, smiling at the thought as Sir Richard spoke once more. To pass the just sentence of this court, Her Grace, Queen Margaery, Targaryen. Sir Richard said, and Margaery walked out with a Kingsguard escort. Barristan, Arthur, Walder, Loras, and Sir Richard Horp all present, and as she took her seat, they took up their position around her. Margaery, she'd woken early to an empty bed. Janshi having told her that he would be sparring in the morning, something she'd almost argued with him about until he told her that he'd not actually be crossing blades. After taking a bath and dressing, she called for food to be brought, and smiled when Jay returned to eat with her, both of them breaking their fast to more silence than she had hoped for. Given the day that was ahead of them, it was something she could understand, and so she didn't press the issue. That he didn't wish to be there was something he'd explained to her as they'd lain in their bed together. Margaery's already understanding his reasons and in a way welcoming them. Her husband had been through far too much in his life and was barely over the last emotionally worrisome thing he'd faced. He did not need to face another right now. Certainly not one in the shape of Catelyn Stark, Tully, Baelish, or whatever name any wished to name her as. He'd surprised her with his choice of judges, but not with his reasoning for them. Wyman Manderley to represent the North, Tyrion to represent his family and Ellaria, while family too to her husband, and so to her also. Was there more because she was a mother than for that reason? Jaxline telling her that perhaps a mother could see something in Catelyn's actions that someone else may not. She loved her husband truly. She did. His heart was big enough to love many, and it was fierce enough to bring down retribution against any who dared to harm those he cared about. When it came to himself, though, that fire was far more muted, even now. Even after all she'd done, and with what he wished her sentence to be, he still was thinking more of his family than himself. On this, though he was very wrong, Ellaria, while being a mother, would also have a mother's love for those she considered family. And Catelyn would receive no easy hearing from her because of it. As for her own feelings regarding the woman who'd tried to kill the man she loved, Catelyn was very lucky her husband felt as he did. She looked over to Jabel, who seemed to be miles away, and she was glad to see he'd eaten, at least, his appetite coming and going since he'd awakened. When he caught her looking at him, he smiled and reached out his hand to take her own and bring it to his lips. "You should go," he said as he kissed it softly. You'll be all right here alone?" she asked, and he kissed her hand once more. "I wish to think of other things, to spend the day on thoughts which matter. Ghost and I will sit, and I'll reach out to the rest of my familiars. Maybe I'll even spend the day soaring the sky and looking down on the lands below. I'm sure one of the birds will be flying over some pleasant views," he said with a smile. She got up from her seat and walked over to him, kissing him deeply before telling him how much she loved him, and listening as he told her the same in return. Sora Bonifer had men of the 100 to stand by as his guard this day. Jay insisting that the Kingsguard all needed to be present, dismissing her and Barristan's arguments that there needed to be at least one of them with him by saying he'd not be leaving the room and that Ghost was with him. Jay saying that with Sora Bazier standing with Sola, Jason, and Jenny, they could not afford to be seen with another Kingsguard not present, and so, while he faced their disagreements, he refused to back down. After kissing him once more and asking again if he was all right, Margaery left the room and walked with the Kingsguard to the throne room, doing her best not to look at the woman when she entered. She moved instead to take her seat and ready to play her role. She listened as Sir Richard finished explaining the procedure and found her eyes were now roaming over Catelyn as she stood there. The woman in front of her vastly changed from the one who'd come to Highgarden and gloated over the perceived death of her husband. Her red hair was tinged with gray. She had deep bags under her eyes and her skin was pale and sallow. It didn't bring her the comfort it should have, but it wasn't because she felt any sympathy for the woman. More that she felt she'd not suffered enough. "How do you plead, Lady Catelyn?" Margaery asked when Sir Richard was done. "Not guilty," the woman replied as arrogantly as ever. "Bring in the first witness." Sir Richard said, and the room hushed as Bren was brought in. She looked on as Bronn walked into the throne room. The former sellsword was now Tyrion's sworn sword and had spent most of the past few moons in Dorne on some task that Tyrion had set him to. He was far better dressed than he had been on most occasions that she'd seen him. His stock had risen much in the past few years, and if Sir Richard was to be believed, and he always was, as Jay would say, then he'd soon be a lord of a keep in Dorne. Your name? Richard asked. Bronn, tell the court of your connections with the plot to kill Jaehaerys Targaryen. I was hired by Lord Petyr Baelish as a catspaw and sent to Lannisport with orders to kill the boy who was then known to all as Jon Snow. Bronn said, Yet you did not. Why? Richard asked. My true employer wouldn't have appreciated it, Bronn said with a smile. And who did you work for, truly? Richard asked. Usse. What happened in Lannisport? Richard asked. She listened as he told of the mummery they performed, and that it was Jack who'd come up with the idea, laughs ringing round the room, when Bronn admitted pissing himself, when Ghost got a little too close. After he was done, she and the rest of the court waited while Richard called the next witness. Catelyn nearly collapsing to the ground when Petyr Baelish walked in under guard and then stood ready to speak. Lord Baelish, we've just heard the evidence of a former cutthroat who names you as being part of a plot to kill the king. Would you like to respond? Richard asked. In my defense, I was unaware of His Grace's true identity at the time. Littlefinger said, Is that your only defense? Richard asked. It is, Cerys. I beg the court's time while I try to explain my part in things. The things I did for the love of a woman, for the love of my wife, Catelyn. She first contacted me in relation to His Grace. A number of years ago, and together with her brother, Lord Edmure, we organized an attack on His Grace in the Riverlands. After that attack failed and her father, Lord Hoster, passed, Lady Catelyn traveled to King's Landing with her brother to see him named as the new Lord Paramount, and during this time begged me to see the bastard dead. Her words, not mine. Your Grace. Littlefinger said, nodding to her and making her skin crawl in the process. This was when you hired a catspaw? Richard asked. It was Sir, the outcome of which I assume you've just been told? Littlefinger said. We have. After the attempts failed, what other actions did you and Lady Catelyn take? Sir Richard asked. She listened as Littlefinger almost, but not quite, laid out the case for treason against himself and Catelyn, stopping just short of admitting that they knew the truth of Jade's birth. Instead claiming they both believed it to be a lie right up until they ran. Her fingers gripped her dress tightly, and she closed her eyes to remove them both from her sight, her anger rising all the time. And what have you been offered for your testimony here today, Lord Baelish? Sir Richard asked. Consideration, sir. I was promised my motives would be taken under consideration, and that, if I gave a full and frank version of events, that my head would not be on the block when my own sentence was pronounced. Your own trial is to come, Lord Baelish, Wyman asked. I have admitted my guilt, my lord. I intend to plead so to His Grace, and beg his forgiveness, and only ask that what I've said today is given its due weight. Littlefinger said as Richard bid the guards take him away. She waited until the man was gone before she looked to the woman who seemed to be in a daze. Marguerite, having expected outbursts or claims of innocence and being surprised to have heard neither. Lady Catelyn, do you have anything to say in your defense? She asked to no reply. Lady Catelyn? She asked again. Very well, Sir Richard. Please sum up. Thank you, Your Grace. Members of the court, you've heard evidence of the actions taken on behalf of Lady Catelyn. I could present evidence of Sir Richard began only for Marguerite to see someone hand a note to Ned Stark, and for him to look worried upon reading it. Holding up her hand, she got Sir Richard to stop. Lord Stark, is something wrong? She asked. Forgive me, Your Grace, but my wife is with the Grammy Aster. Our babe is being born. Ned Stark said, both happy and panicked at the same time. Go be with her, Lord Stark, she said with a smile, as James' uncle turned to his brother and then raced from the room. It took a few moments for the throne room to calm down, and then for Sir Richard to begin to speak some more. This time the interruption was much louder, and the outburst she'd expected finally came. Lies. Lies. All of it is damn lies. He's a bastard. Spawn of the seven hells, and he's put you all under his spell. King. He's no king of mine. All he ever wished for was to take what wasn't his, to bring my family down so he could laugh at us all. He's wicked and wanton, as all bastards are, and I curse the day he was spawned and the whore that gave birth to him. I curse the fact that I didn't smother him in his crib or throw him from the window of the nursery he had no right to be in. Each day he breathes is an affront to the seven, and I damn him and all of you for falling for his lies. Had I only truly known the depths that he would sink to, then I'd have taken a knife and cut his filthy bastard throat myself. My only mistake was letting others do what I should have done. As for this court, none of you have the right to judge me. I am true to my gods and can see what it is that none of you can. Mark my words, if you don't rise up and slay this filthy bastard, then he'll be the death of you all." Catelyn screamed. Marjorie rose from the throne and could see the shocked looks around the room. The woman standing in front of them had spittle coming from her mouth, and so she turned from her and to the judges themselves. "You've heard the evidence and the words from Lady Baelish's own lips. How do you find in this case?" she asked. "Guilty," Lord Wyman said. "Guilty," Tyrion said. "Guilty." Ilaria said, her eyes matching the fire of her dress as she did so. Marguerite sat back down on the throne, the ruling she was about to make, meeting the authority it provided. "My husband, despite what you tried to do to him, Lady Baelish, despite the hurt you caused him over the years, and the pain you caused him to feel, my husband would be merciful. Hearing the words you spoke here today, my husband would be merciful still, despite the fact that your actions robbed the family of a father and my husband of a leal protector. My husband would be merciful," she said, her voice firm and steady. She waited for a moment before she spoke again, her voice now taking on a different tone. "My husband would sentence you to live out your days out serving the faith. He'd send you to the sept so those gods you claim to serve could see the benefits of your service. He would sentence you to the Silent Sisters so you could see the true pains of death and perhaps they reflect upon the life you stole and the one you tried to end. My husband has a true heart, Lady Catelyn, and he knows that despite you having none of your own, that your suffering would cause pain to those he cares for. My husband, Lady Catelyn, would be merciful. I would not." She looked at the woman and at her alone, the rest of the throne room fading away as Marguerite stared into eyes that were still full of hate and showed no regret. "Lady Catelyn Baelish, it is the sentence of this court that you are to executed for the crimes you've committed. May the Seven have mercy on your soul," Marguerite said to cheers as she rose and walked from the throne room. King's Landing, 2098 AC. Jaime Targaryen. He lay on the floor with his eyes closed and went traveling over skies, over water, running through the fields, and then deep into a place that he cared not to be. Once he was done, he opened his eyes and walked to the desk, reaching out and taking the paper out and began to write the letter. The words flowed, though he wished they would not. Jaxley hating what he was about to do and yet knowing that he must do it anyway. When he was finished, he walked to his room and began to put on his armor, standing in front of the looking glass to make sure he tied it just right. While an impressive set, it was nowhere near as impressive as his Valyrian suit was, but it would be another moon or two until that was ready. Gendry had not been able to come when he sent for him, and so the repairs were taking far longer than they would normally have. He'd thought about letting Tobomot work on it, but in the end had decided that Gendry would be best, the smith having worked on it already once before. When he was done, he picked up his sword and looked around the room before walking over to grab the journal and the bag of food that he wished to bring with him. Ghost looked at him both in annoyance and judgment, he felt. The wolf is not happy that he couldn't come with him and that he was leaving at all. James Sirrett, though, knew he had to go, and go now. Kinvora's words had only reinforced that, while Euron was a dangerous enemy and one they needed to deal with, there was one that needed dealing with first. Bloodraven couldn't be allowed to interfere again, either with events beyond the wall or with those on this side, and while James Sirrett felt he'd not be able to affect him as he had, he couldn't be certain. He knelt down in front of Ghost and told the wolf what he wished him to do before he moved towards the space in the wall. "The cove," he said through his bond. As he moved out into the tunnels and headed toward the one which would lead him out into the cove, he knew that upon his return he'd have much explaining to do. Jaime and the others would be angry with him, and as for Marguerite, it was best not to think about that for now, at least. Jane knew that she'd be hurt, concerned, and angrier than she had ever been with him once she found the note, and yet he was willing to do what he must. It took him some time to walk through the tunnels, and the darkness was welcome to him. The light, when it finally did shine through, pained his eyes, and it took him some time to readjust. Stepping out onto the cove, he was happy to see Rhaenys there, waiting for him, and he almost ran the final few feet before he climbed up onto her back. He tied his pack to the saddle, and almost as soon as he did so, he was in the sky. Jax led here ready for the flight north and beyond the wall. The grove had been easy enough to find, and the weirwood that stood in it was incredible. Jack smiling at the thoughts of seeing it in person, if not at the thoughts of what else he'd see once he was there. To his surprise, though, it wasn't north that Rhaenys flew, but to the south, and when he asked her, she answered with just one word. Home.